If you can get your herd into the high fertility cycle by being aggressive with reproduction, everything's just going to work better. Cows are going to be healthier. Milk production is going to be better. Once you have good reproduction, you have a lot of options. If you don't have good repro, you have no options.
Welcome back to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. I'm Reagan Bluel from the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and today we're meeting with Dr. Paul Fricke and Megan Lauber from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And if you followed and heard last month's edition, we were talking about reproduction and specifically illuminating these details around early pregnancy loss. This month's theme is also reproduction. It continues as we all know, Dr. Fricke is a well-known animal science researcher. He and his team set out to better understand how can we improve pregnancy outcomes based on synchronization. And so all of these findings were summarized in an article titled "The Effect of Postpartum Body Condition Score Change on Pregnancy Outcomes of Lactating Jersey Cows Inseminated for Service with Sex Jersey Semen or Conventional Beef Semen after a Synchronized Estrus versus Synchronized Ovulation." So that was a big, long title talking about brown cows and fertility and using sex semen or beef semen. So before we get going on the project, could you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I can go ahead and start. So I grew up on a dairy farm in Nebraska, where my dad farmed with my grandfather and my uncle. We milked about 60 Holsteins in a 2x2 swing parlor, so I grew up milking cows. My formal appointment is between research and extension in dairy cattle reproduction. And I'll just go ahead and introduce Megan and let her take it away. But Megan Lauber is one of my current PhD students.
Yes, thanks, Paul, for the introduction. And thanks again, Reagan, for the invitation on the podcast. As Paul mentioned, my name is Megan Lauber. I grew up, similar background to Paul's. I grew up on a 60-cow registered Holstein herd just south of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, where my family still farms today. Now there's a few jerseys, though. Got to give that credit to my sister-in-law. She infiltrated with a few jerseys. And really, for me, I wanted to continue on with my interest in dairy, so I attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison for my undergraduate degree, really found a love for research and looked for opportunities, and I was very fortunate. Dr. Fricke had opening for a master's student with Paul in 2018 for my master's, continued to love research that I'm doing in reproductive management, primarily with sex semen, the economics of it, the basic physiology, and how we should implement it with management strategies in our dairies. Finished my master's in March of 2021, and I've continued on with Paul as a PhD student. Really have enjoyed my time and the ability to do great research.
That's fantastic. Yes. And understanding that sex semen side of things is so critically important, especially for the brown cows, right? Those jerseys and making sure that we understand their fertility. As we think about the evolution of reproductive physiology over just the last 30 years, right? Over 30 years, we've made a lot of progress in the reproductive status of our herd, with pregnancy rates ranging from the teens all the way up to, a preg rate in the 30s is increasingly commonplace. And it's certainly a goal to strive towards if you're not there yet. What that affords is that strategic culling, or in this case, strategic breeding opportunities to the farm to help offset the cost of production. I love it. It's really good. And so definitely important to best understand the dynamics associated with that. Could one of you guys talk me through, really this project is a bit like an onion, and each layer kind of builds upon itself as far as what some of the objectives were, looking at first the reproductive strategy of synchronization, and then what effect it has based on the semen that you use. And then nutritionally, where is she with her energy through the transition, and what impact does that have? So let's start on that first layer. And can one of you please describe the two different synchronization protocols that you used?
The context of the study was, as Megan said, to combine. We kind of like the idea of stacking reproductive technologies. We know that we call double Ovsync, for example, a fertility program. And you mentioned, Reagan, that the initial Ovsync program, when it came out in 1995 made it that changed everything, right? It was a
Mm-hmm.
way to put semen into cows, but we didn't necessarily see an improvement in fertility with the original Ovsync program. So I came on board in about 95, and that's kind of when that first paper was published by Wiltbank and Pursley. And then over the next 25 years, we worked to improve fertility of that program. And one of the ways we can do that is we can pre-synchronize cows, and it originally started with the two prostaglandins. We know now that there's a lot of cows that aren't cycling. Prostaglandins don't affect those cows, so really that's the idea for the double Ovsync, using an Ovsync protocol to pre-synchronize the cows for the second Ovsync, because that initial Ovsync will overcome the anovular condition through combining GnRH and prostaglandin. And then, we had protocols set up, and this is really an interesting story. When you get the cows so well synchronized to begin on day 7, that's really what the first Ovsync does, is gets them to start the second Ovsync on day 7. It fixed some problems, but it created a new problem, and that new problem was a lack of luteal regression. If you get so many cows on day 7, the corpus luteum acquires luteolytic capacity around that time, especially in these older cows, the multiparous cows. And so the rate limiting step to fertility in the program really was regression of that corpus luteum. And so that's where the second prostaglandin came into play. A second prostaglandin 24 hours after the first prostaglandin in the second Ovsync. That was kind of the key to unlocking fertility to that protocol. And when that second prostaglandin went in there, we just saw fertility pop in these lactating dairy cows. And so
if I can interrupt you for
yeah,
2 seconds, I'm going to zoom out 30,000 foot a little bit here. If some of you were glazing over, so there's really two structures. He's talking about the CL, or the corpus luteum, and then you've got the follicle, and they're generating either estrogen or progesterone, and that's really what we're trying to synchronize here with all these series of shots is just those structures there on the ovary. And I really want to zoom in a little bit on what you just got done saying. Your prostaglandin injection at day 24 or 25 of the cycle, of the synchronization cycle, which in most cases, in this particular case, started on day, say, 42, 43 in milk. And then 24 days later, we gave a lute shot back to back, right? Now if we could zoom back in, explain it, please explain to them on the luteolysis. What's that mean? Why are we trying to knock that down?
Yeah, that was a big issue. This was clear back in the 1960s. Jim Lauderdale at Upjohn at the time, they were looking at, what is it that controls the corpus luteum? What is it that makes the corpus luteum regress? And so a cow comes into estrus, she ovulates a follicle. That follicle then becomes a corpus luteum and secretes progesterone, which will maintain pregnancy. If a cow doesn't get pregnant around day 16 to 18 of the estrus cycle, the cow's uterus, the non-pregnant uterus, will release endogenous prostaglandin F2 alpha. That travels back to the ovary and causes regression of the CL, so that you start a new cycle and the cow has another opportunity to become pregnant. And so Jim Lauderdale, when he was at Upjohn, discovered that prostaglandin F2 alpha was the luteolytic substance in cattle. It was produced, the original product was Luteolysis. That's why you're using that term lute, Reagan.
Sorry.
But
Yes.
we have cloprostanol as well, which is a synthetic
Estromate.
analog of prostaglandin. Yep, estromate. And what we learned is that we could regress that corpus luteum earlier than, say, day 16 or 18, but there's a limit to that. So after that follicle ovulates after estrus, for the first about 6 to 7 days, when that new corpus luteum is forming, it doesn't have what we call luteolytic capacity. You can give prostaglandin, but it doesn't regress. And so you've got this interesting period of about a week after ovulation where you can't regress the corpus luteum. And so that was really the key in an Ovsync program. What that first GnRH treatment does is it ovulates a follicle, forms a corpus luteum. You have to regress that corpus luteum 7 days later, and then that synchronized follicle will go on. And then at the second GnRH, you ovulate it and you can do a timed AI. And so the rate limiting step was because, as I said before, because in a double Ovsync, because that first Ovsync does such a nice job at getting cows exactly to day 7, we get a fairly good ovulatory response there. The rate limiting step was getting that CL to regress, okay? And work that we did looking at how fast progesterone comes down after given a single prostaglandin. And once we kind of realized, well, it was a luteal regression problem, it's like, okay, let's give a second prostaglandin 24 hours after that first one. And that completes the luteolytic process. And it was about, I think, 14 or 15% of the multiparous cows were not regressing. And so that fixes that problem. And, one other thing I'll say, Reagan, factors that affect fertility to an estrus in high producing dairy cows are quite different than factors that affect fertility to a synchronized breeding program, a complicated one like double Ovsync. And really, it's about getting the cow to do what we want her to do when we give each of those treatments. And so once we fix that problem with luteal regression, then the cows synchronized really well and we got high fertility. And that's really what has pushed. That's why, Reagan, that's why we're using so much sex and beef semen, because we have pushed pregnancy rates, we've doubled pregnancy rates, and so we can produce more replacements than we need. Hence, people are starting to genomically test herds. This is what I talk about with the stackable technologies, right?
Yeah.
You can use genomic testing. If you don't have really good repro, you don't need to do genomic testing. When you have good repro,
you don't have a choice.
Yeah, you don't have a choice, right? So when you have good repro, now you can genomically test your herd. You can select the best animals for replacements, generating placements. We use sex semen on maybe that 30% of the lactating herd. And then the rest of those cows, we want a calf to reinitiate the lactation cycle, but we don't necessarily want a replacement. So we can increase value to that calf by using beef on dairy. And that's become a big thing. And Megan has a very nice paper where she just looked at kind of a snapshot in the United States and a large data set of how people are using sexed beef semen. And maybe I'll throw it over to Megan to just comment on that paper.
Yes, please.
Yes, so it's amazing to see from 2019 to 2021. It was herds primarily in the Midwest, but data from Dairy Records Management System, we collaborated with their group, looking at how sexed and beef semen was being used in our Holstein herd here in the U.S., as well as our Jersey herd. And it's very interesting linear trends that you see, that we continue to see an increase in the amount of sexed and beef semen being used, like you'd expect it to be, using more sex semen and on more fertile animals, our younger nulliparous heifers, primiparous cows, as well as earlier services like first and second service. When we're seeing sex semen being used for inseminations, while seeing more beef semen being used on our older, more multiparous cows, as well as at later services. So seeing the combination of those two technologies. And for me, what was interesting with that data is we saw a herd size effect of this. So there was a linear relationship that as herd size increased, for example, herds over 1,000 cows, those herds were using more sexed and more beef semen compared to herds that were less than 100 cows. And we could talk about different reasons why that may be. We don't have a solidified reason for that, but I think part of it is some of this aspects of reproductive performance. We can look at herds benchmarked, whether it's DRMS or other management systems, that generally larger herds have greater reproductive performance, which allows them to adopt these technologies, as well as the economies of scale to do so. So I think that's really powerful. And in addition, what Paul mentioned with the fertility program aspect is also we have cows in the high fertility cycle now, and looking at these periparturient management aspects that really are important for increasing reproductive performance.
Gives you a lot of flexibility and options out there. But regardless of herd size, regardless of what those data was saying, it's not, if you're a small herd, you can do this too. You just have to focus on the details, and I'm passionate about that. And so let's talk a little bit about those details. We've got the double Ovsync protocol, and I interrupted you so rudely. At day 24 and 25 is when you're giving that prostaglandin, and then if you could take it from there and finish the discussion about these protocols that you enrolled 1,200 Jersey cows into.
Yeah, so I mean, after you get luteal regression, you have a synchronized follicular wave, and you can give that second GnRH treatment to induce ovulation, and then you can do a timed insemination. So again, that's our double Ovsync fertility program. So that was one of the treatments in the study. We randomly allocated cows to either get a double Ovsync protocol. Now, the second protocol that you discussed in the paper was one that we kind of made up a little bit. It was just a protocol to induce estrus. So really the question was, let's look at the difference in fertility using sex and beef semen in Jersey cows after a synchronized ovulation to a fertility program versus a synchronized estrus. And that second protocol, we started with the GnRH treatment. 7 days later, gave prostaglandin. 14 days later, a second prostaglandin, and then a day later a third prostaglandin. That protocol is not something probably that most people would want to use, but it just brought cows into estrus. And the key to this study is they're in estrus at about the same day in milk. So we can make it apples to apples comparison of fertility of the cows bred to timed AI to a fertility program versus estrus. And so that's how the experiment was designed. And I'll just mention also the sex versus beef semen is really two independent studies. The farm decided which cows got sex semen, which cows got beef semen. We would love to do a study where we could randomly allocate cows to semen type, but that's not going to happen, right? So they decided which cows got mated to sex and beef. Within those matings, then we randomized them to get the double Ovsync protocol or the estrus protocol.
Sure.
And then we could evaluate reproductive performance from there.
Absolutely. So if for whatever reason she didn't read the book or respond to the injections that you were giving with the synchronization or inducing of estrus, and you didn't see heat, then there was that safety net enrollment where you went ahead and made sure through synchronization, both treatments, whether it was double Ovsync or the synchronization of estrus, both of them had semen in them on or around day 80.
Exactly. And just let's start by framing what I call the equation of reproduction. The rate at which cows get pregnant, the 21-day pregnancy rate, is determined by the service rate, the rate at which we breed cows, and then the conception rate, the rate at which the cows that we breed become pregnant. Okay. So we looked at both of those things in this study. So if you look at, for example, on the beef semen, the jerseys that were mated to beef semen on the estrus versus the double Ovsync protocol. With double Ovsync, you breed 100% of the cows. That's a huge advantage, okay? And I think one thing when I work with farmers, they'd like to catch all their cows in estrus. They try hard to catch all their cows in estrus, but because they're anovular cows, we only caught 78% of those cows in estrus, right? So right away, advantage double Ovsync on the service rate side of that equation. And then when you look at the difference in fertility, which is the other side of the equation, it was about a 9 percentage point advantage for double Ovsync compared to estrus. And with the beef semen, in these jerseys, we were impressed. I mean, the conception rates were well above 50%.
Right.
Even at the second preg check, it was amazing. These little jerseys are quite fertile, and especially if you put them on a synchronization program like that. So the advantage in both sides of that equation go to double Ovsync. You're going to get more cows pregnant faster when you submit them for first service to a synchronized breeding program than waiting for those cows to come to estrus. And Megan, you can go ahead and describe what happened on the sex semen side.
And so a sex semen, it's a very similar story that when we synchronize cows with a double Ovsync, like Paul mentioned, it's a timed breeding. We have 100% of cows inseminated, which is great. That makes our life easier. But again, as we mentioned, we can only detect so many cows in estrus. We have other issues with failure expression, labor to detect estrus, or just simply anovular cows that aren't cycling. So you only, again, detect about 75 to 80% of cows in estrus. So the remainder have to go and receive some type of hormonal treatment for a timed breeding to be inseminated. Like you said, we can't forget about those cows. And so when we look at the relative fertility of those inseminated off of a timed breeding off a double Ovsync versus a true detection of estrus, AI after a detection of estrus, it's about a 6 to a 7 percentage point advantage for our double Ovsync cows, having more pregnancy outcomes compared to those detected in estrus and inseminated. So it's a very similar story. And when you look at the estrus detection group, including those that we didn't detect and were put on a timed breeding, that difference grows even larger, closer to about 8 or 9 percentage points. And so again, that likely the difference increases because, again, we have those cows that we're not cycling, that we failed to detect, those cows that are likely going to have lower fertility put on that timed breeding. That's also going to further create that spread, if that makes sense. So it's a very similar finding. And I think it's important too. Some people say, okay, well, with that synchronized breeding that you're doing for a fertility program, double Ovsync protocol, it's just because you're increasing synchrony. You have more cows synchronized. But in this paper, you can see that we've gone through that and looked in a step-by-step basis. And when you look within synchronized cows between both treatments, that relative fertility difference still stays. So
you can tease it out.
It's not just that we synchronize more cows. There are intrinsic aspects of the double Ovsync that we're controlling follicular development and that hormonal milieu to improve fertility.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to the hormonal manipulations that might actually be happening there at the follicular level when a GnRH shot is given?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is for many years we synchronized estrus just with prostaglandins. And the limitation to putting semen into cows when you synchronize an estrus, of course, is catching the cows in estrus so you can put semen into them. And number two, the fertility aspect, the lower fertility aspect. So we don't call these protocols estrus synchronization protocols anymore. We call them fertility programs, again, because we synchronize the follicular wave, because we can induce luteal regression in a timely fashion. We can get 100% of the cows we put on the protocol inseminated, and they will have higher fertility than if we bred them to estrus. And based on that equation of reproduction, it's a very powerful way to push that equation and get very high pregnancy rates. And so I think the bottom line for your dairy farmers who are listening to this, these protocols, put them on a piece of paper. They're complex. They involve 7 treatments, right? And so there's a lot of treatments. People see all those treatments. They're there for a specific reason in a specific timing. To get good results with this protocol, you have to comply with the treatments. So you got to give the right stuff to the right cow on the right day and breed the right group of cows. But if you can do that, these protocols more than pay for themselves by very effectively getting these cows pregnant. And for a first service, it's very powerful because all cows get submitted for a first service. So you're working on all the cows, and we can get half of our cows pregnant to first service now. So it's kind of amazing where we've come with reproduction in these programs and protocols. And it works with sex semen. It's kind of the story that we were telling in this particular study.
That's absolutely incredible. And I think your team up there in Wisconsin are kind of like an army of reproductive scientists. And, and there's some lieutenants here that are blowing the horn and saying, this is what we need to be doing next. And without really taking the time that it took over the last, say, 30 years and really understanding what's happening at that ovary level to piece apart the parts of the equation that you were referring to, we couldn't be where we're at. And it's so exciting to think about where we will be 30 years from today. It's kind of hard to even think about what that might look like. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the body condition score impact of fertility, and specifically zooming in on the animals that were losing body condition score. And I'm just going to kind of smear it out and say over the first month of lactation, when you measured body condition score, there was a subset of animals that lost greater than half a point, right? And could you talk a little bit about how did that impact your pregnancies per AI on a percentage basis?
I'm going to take a step back. I'll let Megan explain the results from the study, but I do want to take a step back and talk about this concept that we've been calling the high fertility cycle.
Yeah.
Okay. And what this goes back, it's very interesting. We've known that changes in body condition score play a role in reproductive performance. So back in the 1970s, Bill Thatcher of Florida showed cows that lose more than a point in body condition score post-calving had very poor fertility. So we've kind of known this, okay? Probably in about the 1990s, a researcher, his name was Jack Britt, he's still around, still giving a lot of talks. He put some physiology to this hypothesis. And what he did was he had a small herd of cows at North Carolina State University. He just body condition scored those cows for 10 weeks. And in the first 3 weeks, okay, so the first 3 weeks postpartum are critical. He could put cows into 2 groups. There was a group of cows that calved at a higher body condition score, and they lose for those 3 weeks. And then that was about half of them. And the other half of cows calved at a lower body condition score and didn't lose. Once you put those in those 2 groups, look at them across 10 weeks, what he found was the cows that kind of maintained body condition score had 60-some% conception rate at first service. The ones that lost and regained had about a 25% conception rate. And so there's this relationship between body condition loss, and this is one of the things that I'm trying to tell farmers. We've taught farmers and veterinarians and students that all cows lose body condition score postpartum, and that's not true. They don't all lose. There's these cows that maintain. There's a few cows that gain. Okay, so what Jack said was, well, these follicles are growing up during this period of negative energy balance, and he hypothesized that something about negative energy balance is causing a problem with fertility. Now we move forward. Richard Pursley at Michigan State University, we've got a couple studies from UW-Madison defined this high fertility cycle. And that's just that cows that calve in a lower body condition score, not too low. If they're too low, they'll be anovular. Okay. So I like to see them like right around 3. Okay. If you can get them to calve at 3, then they don't lose body condition. They kind of maintain it post calving. They don't have as many periparturient health issues. They have higher fertility. You can get them pregnant quickly, and they don't spend a lot of time in late lactation getting fat. Okay.
You bet.
So we have been interested in this whole thing. And so Megan body condition scored these jerseys at calving and at about 30 days. That's that key period. And took that body condition score. And then she did this very interesting analysis, which I'm just going to turn over to Megan and she can explain what she found.
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, Paul, you took the point I was going to say. I always try to make sure that's right up in front for everyone to realize, like you said, that not all cows lose body condition. That's something that we've been ingrained in our minds so long, and we've seen it now over several studies that we've looked at this. That's not the case. And so, but as we know, that transition period is really key for our lactating dairy cows. So I looked at the body condition score change from about 7 days in milk to about 30-ish days in milk, and looked at that change and created what we call tertiles, or 3 groups based on their body condition score loss. And so groups consisted of those cows that lost greater than half a point of body condition score, those that lost a quarter of a point, so minimal loss, or those cows that maintained or gained. And what's interesting about this study is generally the studies that have done this, all cows have been on the same reproductive management protocol. But with this study, we actually randomized cows to receive timed insemination after a fertility program, our double Ovsync, or an artificial insemination after detection of estrus. And so it's really interesting when we look at across these 3 groups. Surprisingly, there is no difference in the fertility of our double Ovsync cows, whether they had excessive body condition score loss, minimal, or maintained or gained. And similarly, there was really no difference for those cows that lost a quarter or maintained or gained, whether they were inseminated after a double Ovsync protocol for timed artificial insemination or after detection of estrus and AI in that aspect. But really, where this treatment effect was manifested, favoring that double Ovsync protocol for improving pregnancy outcomes, was for those cows that lost a lot of body condition score, for those that lost greater or equal to half a point. And this was by about 15 to 17 percentage points. So it's quite a dramatic increase in fertility for those. Yeah, it's very profound.
Yeah, and you can visually see it there on figure 4, and I'll put a link to the paper. This is, of course, open access from the Journal of Dairy Science, and there, about in the middle of the paper, is a beautiful image really capturing that sizable difference. And this is really, I like to think about how this could really impact management, can change this, right? And it's all about employing these different tools that we have in the toolbox to encourage that positive feedback loop that improves their status.
Yeah, and what I should make sure that's clear too, which is very interesting, this is solely comparing those cows receiving a timed artificial insemination after that fertility program or double Ovsync versus those that were detected in estrus and artificially inseminated. This does not include those cows, those about 25% of cows that we did not detect in estrus and put on an Ovsync protocol or gave GnRH and began an Ovsync protocol. So we really don't have any of those anovular cows within this condition. So it's interesting to see this physiological effect just for those that we actually do detect in estrus.
Right.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because if you pull them out.
Yeah, they showed us that they were bred because they showed estrus. So these are estrus cows, cows showing estrus that lost a lot of body condition. And double Ovsync seems to keep fertility high in that group, whereas the estrus breedings, like Megan said, are like almost 20 percentage points lower.
It's really incredible. Wow. Neat. You went into a really impressive review of the literature talking about what might be happening inside that cow. Could you put some physiological goggles on for us and plunge right in?
Sure. So I think part of that too is this is speculation of what we think potentially could be happening. We don't have as much research. I think that's a gap that we have trying to understand some of these neuroendocrinology aspects with reproduction, with these metabolic factors of adiposity. So when we look at those cows that lost a lot of body condition score, when adipose tissue produces leptin, which is a factor of showing of how much condition our lactating dairy cows have. And so those cows that calved in with a high body condition score that were then put into a negative energy balance and then lose all that body condition score, those cows go from a high leptin to a very low
High
leptin
fat,
environment.
low fat.
Yes,
Yeah.
because we're losing that fat that our lactating dairy cow has. And so that production of leptin is decreasing. And leptin is thought to be important in regulating GnRH secretion from the hypothalamus or the brain of the lactating dairy cow.
That's so cool, right?
And so
fat controls this GnRH. It's crazy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, to be honest with you, I think we don't fully have it well understood. We've used sheep models, but we haven't done as much in dairy cows because some of that neuroendocrinology work is a little bit challenging to do. Yeah. But it's thought that may have a role in how GnRH is secreted in lactating dairy cows. And so by submitting these cows that lose a lot of condition, that have low leptin at the time of insemination, by submitting them to a double Ovsync protocol and giving them GnRH treatments, that we may better actually induce cyclicity, control follicular development, and later on timing of ovulation for those that have that low leptin environment compared to those in our estrus detection protocol, where they have low leptin, but we're not giving them multiple GnRH treatments to actually induce cyclicity, continue to have more regulated follicular development, and also control timing of ovulation.
I think it's a really interesting story. Like I said, we wanted to try our best to explain our observations. That's one of the things we try to do in our papers. And I think this is, it's a really interesting observation. And this is how one observation leads to studies in another area. And so I think it'd be interesting to test this. But certainly double Ovsync maintained fertility of that lowest third of the cows that lost the most body condition compared to the estrus cows.
Kind of just help erase the issue with the GnRH side of things. It's good.
It did. Those treatments with GnRH seem to fix the problem in the cow. She's, these cows that are in that condition, they seem to come into estrus. I mean, one speculation might be that they're just not ovulating. Maybe, you're breeding cows at the wrong time, or cows that don't ovulate in that particular situation.
Well, we're getting close to the end here, and one of my favorite questions to always ask is, what would you like boots on the ground dairy producers to gain from this really informative project?
I can start with that one, and Megan, you can follow up. Again, what we talk about in our neck of the wood is kind of this reproduction revolution. And what's driven that reproduction revolution? Well, it started with ways to improve service rates, right? So a lot of our farms have bought these heat detection systems, the activity monitoring systems. Those are great, can catch cows in heat. Ovsync can allow us to put semen into cows. And now we've got fertility programs. We have the high fertility cycle. And so now we know how to drive fertility. My suggestion to the farms out there listening to this, get your herd into the high fertility cycle. How do we do that? We're aggressive with reproduction. How do we be aggressive with reproduction? Well, we use the best tools that we have. And what is that? That's a double Ovsync program for first breeding, especially if you pair that